It is 4 p.m. here in Sacramento, Thursday, May 16th, and in an hour at 5 p.m., I have a ticket to go see the latest music biopic, Back to Black, which follows the life of Amy Winehouse. This film stars Marisa Abela as Amy Winehouse, the famed singer. And going into this movie, I've obviously not heard the best of things surrounding this movie, but I have two important questions I have going into this movie. The first one is, can Marisa Abela transform into Amy Winehouse, or is this going to feel like kind of a karaoke performance? The second question I have is, Back to Black a musical biopic with something to say? Or is this just going to be a by-the-numbers, boring biopic that in some ways maybe even feels a little disrespectful to the artist? Those are the two questions I have going into Back to Black. If this film can at the very least give positives to those questions, then I might enjoy this movie.
3 hours later.
Well, I just got back from seeing Back to Black, and I don't have good things to report. This Amy Winehouse movie, musical biopic, as you should call it, is not very good. And I remember I had two questions going into this movie. Can Marisa Abela transform into Amy Winehouse? And is Back to Black a musical biopic with something to say? Let's just kind of explore both of those questions real quick in this review. And let's start with the main performance, Marisa, in this movie, who plays, of course, Amy Winehouse, the talented singer who passes at the age of 27. And I don't think Marisa does a bad job in this movie. I think she's serviceable enough as an actress in this role. It's just that the movie doesn't care about exploring Amy Winehouse in any form of significant way. You don't understand her, and you don't understand any of the supporting characters around her. Instead, you're getting the kind of brief wiki summaries of all of these characters. It really does just feel like a movie where they read the greatest hits of a person's life, and that's all that this movie cares about exploring. I went into this movie knowing basically nothing about Amy Winehouse, except for the fact that she made this incredible album, Back to Black, when she was really young, that she had this relationship that was kind of toxic, and that she then passes away at the age of 27 due to alcohol poisoning. And by the end of this movie, that's really all I knew about Amy Winehouse still. It was not a movie that really cared to explore her in any way of substance. You get to spend time with the character of Blake, who's this relationship that she has in her life, and you kind of see their codependency of one another, how they kind of make each other's drugs / alcohol abuse worse and worse, but they just cannot stop being just like together, and like it's so obviously causing harm to both of them. And that would be interesting if this movie was trying to approach Amy Winehouse the same way like a movie like Sid and Nancy explored Sid Vicious. But that's not what Back to Black is actually doing. Instead, Back to Black just kind of has that in the movie, but it doesn't develop the character of Blake anywhere far enough for us to understand who this character is to Amy. And again, it just kind of doesn't develop Amy enough for us to even understand who Blake is to Amy and what that means, because you're supposed to believe that Amy is obsessed with Blake, that they have this whole relationship, that anytime anything happens or like the worst parts of her life or the music, the inspiration of Back to Black is largely caused due to this person of Blake. And you just don't feel it in this movie. You really do not understand this relationship at all. They have very little chemistry in this movie, and it really hampers the movie throughout. I mean, it's just this issue of Back to Black. Really, the plot explores a few big moments in Amy Winehouse's life. It explores her rise, it explores her meeting Blake, it explores her kind of falling more to alcohol abuse, and as their relationship grows more turmoil, it follows the rehab, and then it follows her winning the Grammy for Back to Black. And then obviously we all kind of know where this film ends. Spoiler alert, this film does not actually end with her death. So for anyone who was a little nervous about that, it thankfully doesn't actually show the death on screen. One of the biggest issues with Back to Black is it's just a pacing nightmare. The story, you cannot tell if Amy and Blake have known each other for years and that the story is supposed to take place over like a handful of years. While watching the movie, it really does feel like it's taking place in like a month. Like there is just no sense of time in this movie. And it kind of goes to this development of these two characters where you don't understand anything of this movie, when it's taking place, how long they've been together, any form of development between these people. And it's just really lazy. Sam Taylor Johnson, who directs this movie, I've never thought they were a good director. And this is kind of just further cementing that issue that I have with their direction, where it just always feels so surface level. And I don't think the film looks particularly good. There's a few moments in particular with like where Amy is being chased by the paparazzi, and the decisions that the camera makes, I just don't find appealing. I found them way too visually like moving, like quite literally the camera was just moving too much that it was almost to the point of nausea. And that might be to try to put us in Amy's shoes. Instead, it really just works to make the film look really ugly in certain scenes. And it is just kind of, again, this example of a movie that I don't think really had any purpose, which brings me back to the second point. Is Back to Black a musical biopic with something to say? To that, my answer is kind of definitively no. I don't think this film really has anything to say at all. It has nothing interesting to say about Amy. It is, I think, at times trying to be an exploration of paparazzi and just how that has an effect on this young woman's life, and just the fact that she can have no privacy or peace. But it kind of drops that, or if it doesn't drop it, it doesn't focus on it enough. It's also this movie about this relationship and how toxic this relationship is. But again, it just doesn't focus on that enough. So instead, you're kind of left with a movie that by the end, my feeling while watching the movie is none of the events that happen to Amy Winehouse in this movie really matter, because the character that I met at the beginning is kind of still feels like the character I met by the end of this film. And by that, I mean, it always just kind of felt predestined that this character was going to die to alcohol poisoning at the age of 27, with or without her level of fame. And I don't think that's what the thesis of this movie is trying to be. And obviously, I want to be sensitive. I know people just struggle with alcohol abuse, and there doesn't have to be some sort of huge psychological reason. There doesn't have to be this tragic backstory in their young life to explain why they fall into drugs and alcohol. That's not really what I'm trying to say. I'm not really trying to want this to necessarily even be a psychological study or breakdown of Amy Winehouse's life. But I think that's what the film is trying to do. And that's the issue. When you're trying to do that and you fail so miserably, instead you kind of feel disrespectful. And that's what watching this movie really felt, and was really cemented in the end of this movie. And I don't think this is a spoiler, because it's not actually something you see on screen. But this film ends with this message that comes from Amy Winehouse. And I don't know if this is something that Amy Winehouse said, or if this was something they wrote into the script. And I'm going to say it not verbatim. I'm just going to say it as best from my memory. Is the movie ends with something that Amy Winehouse says, where it's just like, I don't want to be remembered for anything but my voice. If my voice can bring comfort, joy to people, that's all that I really want in life. That is what I want my legacy to be, essentially. Which is a really beautiful and powerful message. And that's how the film ends. And that's what the film wants you to think that this movie is about. Except that this film is far more interested in everything else. Like, it isn't really focused enough on her voice, her talents. Like, it does seem far more interested in watching Amy Winehouse kind of drink herself to death. Like, that is kind of what I felt watching this movie. And it's frustrating, and I found it distasteful. There's no other way to put it. And there's other elements of this movie that I can't really speak to. I know there's been some backlash of the way the father of Amy is explored / portrayed in this movie. I thought it was a pretty kind portrait of a father figure in this movie. And I think a lot of people have issues with it, because it sounds like the father may have had some exploitive patterns. Again, I can't speak of that, but it goes back to a larger point that I have with Back to Black. I just didn't know any of these characters, and I didn't feel anything for any of these characters, and I can't really say I learned anything from this movie. And again, a movie's point isn't necessarily to teach, but when the point of this movie, or I should say, when the movie has no point, then everything ends up kind of just feeling like a mismatch, all kind of globbed together, no real tone, no real message, nothing to really gleam onto in this movie. And instead, I'm watching a movie that feels like every musical biopic, and I've seen it to death, and there's nothing really interesting to say about this film. I mean, there's nothing I can really recommend about this film. I thought Marisa was good enough in her portrayal of Amy Winehouse. It very much reminded me of a celebrity going on like The Tonight Show, and then Fallon asking them like, oh, do you do a great celebrity impression? And they're like, oh, I do this really good Amy Winehouse impression. And they do it, and you're like, oh yeah, woo. And then you're just like, that's the movie. Like, I didn't find her to transform anything like that. I think she's serviceable enough in the role, and there are certainly a few really good dramatic beats in this movie. I think specifically with somebody who passes in Amy's life, like that was the moment where you really felt a connection to Amy. And there's some good on-stage performances that Marisa is able to capture in it. I think specifically the performance of Rehab at the Grammys is a really strong moment in this film. Even the aspects of this movie that work to some degree like Marisa's portrayal in this film. It's not enough to recommend this movie by any means. Back to Black, 1.5 out of 5 stars.